Will the massive aid package from the EU and the IMF be the long-term fix, do you think, Nouriel?
In my view, it's going to help in the short run. Certainly, finally, the EU got its act together. They were totally behind the curve, both the EU and the ECB, on helping a situation that's becoming totally disorderly with massive contagion from Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, and eventually global consequences. Last week we had the seizure of stock markets in a number of countries, including the United States. In the short term, it's going to help. The markets are rallying. However, the fundamental problem remains. There are 3 or 4 of them. One is politically, can this country do the kind of fiscal adjustment is needed? Secondly, while you need to raise taxes and cut spending, in the short run, that reduces demand and leads to a more severe recession. So for how long Greece, Spain, Portugal can accept a recession? Another year, another 2 years. Eventually, you cannot ask people austerity if there is no resumption of growth. 3, they have public debt problem, but in many of these countries there are also private debt problems because of the housing bubble, for example, in Ireland or in Spain. So you have private debt liabilities you have to reduce. And finally, this country lost in the last few years a lot of competitiveness. Politically, asking for austerity is going to become increasingly difficult. So there's a whole set of things that this particular rescue package doesn't resolve. The fundamental problems of public debt, of private debt, of growth, of competitiveness, that will take years to resolve.
Then why spend the money? Then why come to the aid of Greece? Why not allow Greece to default? Should that have been the policy move, perhaps?
Well, Greece, like all the other countries, need to do structural reform and fiscal retrenchment, but those countries like Greece that, in my view, have a level of deficit and debt that realistically and politically cannot be reduced, in addition to doing the painful adjustment, require also a restructuring of their debts.
But it would not have been the right move to allow Greece to default?
A disorderly default will be dangerous because the losses for financial institutions in Europe, 3/4 of the public debt of Greece is held outside of Greece. Sure. The contagion and domino effect in terms of collapse of Spain, Portugal, and Italy will be severe, but you can have a controlled restructuring of the public debt of Greece. It has been done in the last decade in a number of emerging markets like Ukraine, Uruguay, Pakistan, Dominican Republic. Is a more friendly way of restructuring the debt than outright default like Russia or Argentina. So I'm in favor of a coercive restructuring, but it's one that is orderly managed as opposed to an orderly default and collapse.
You've called Greece the canary in the coal mine, but when you look at the other pig nations, you look at Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Spain, which is at the biggest risk now outside of Greece?
Well, in the short run, I see that the financial difficulties in Portugal and in Spain are the most severe. Ireland is doing more fiscal adjustment. Italy has a large stock of public debt, but their deficit, relatively speaking, is, unquote, only 5% of GDP, as opposed to 13% like Greece. So they are all needing fiscal consolidation, but the degree is different. In some ways, I would argue that Spain is potentially a bigger problem than Greece for 4 reasons. First of all, the unemployment rate in Spain today is 20%. In Greece is only 10%. Secondly, Spain had a huge housing boom and bubble has gone bust, and now the collateral damage for the real economy is severe. 3, many of the financial institutions and banks and saving banks in Spain are now bust, insolvent, and the fiscal cost of bailing them out is going to be huge, another burden for the public sector. And 4, in the boom years of the housing bubble, the loss of competitiveness of Spanish industry was even bigger because wages were growing very fast compared to productivity. So in some dimensions, actually, Spain is in worse shape than Greece. Now, Greece was on the verge of the abyss today, while Spain is still a couple of miles behind. They need to do, however, a lot of adjustment in Spain, fiscal and otherwise they could end up like Greece.
Is the worst behind the EU for now, at least, because you've argued that financial crises, whether they are what we experience in this country or what is happening across Europe now, are like hurricanes, right? They subside and then they gain strength and then they hit again.
Well, what happened last week was that this storm again happened and hit again. Now there is this financial support to try to prevent the storm from becoming worse. We'll see. In the short run, there is going to be support. However, the fundamental problem of deficits, of debt, public and private, of growth and of competitiveness, and of structural reform needs are going to remain. And unless these countries are going to do the necessary sacrifices in the next few months, the market concerns are going to resurge again in spite of this support package.
Crisis economics, we have certainly had a crash course in that over the last few years. It's also the title of Dr. Nouriel Roubini's new book. You see it right here. Nouriel joins us now to talk about it. Crisis economics, sort of the new normal in a sense, isn't it?
Yes, as I point out, events that were supposed to occur once every 100 years are now occurring with greater frequency. We have had a series of financial crises in emerging markets, in advanced economies. They're becoming more frequent, they're more virulent. The economic and financial and fiscal costs and job losses are more large than before. That's why we have to study crisis economics.
Well, and you know, you argue in this book, and you're credited, and you got the name Dr. Doom for calling the crisis back in 2006, but when you look at it, you argue it was obvious that this was coming. So have we changed? Are we seeing what we need to before the fact now?
One of the points I make exactly in the book is that crises are not black swan events, meaning random outcome from a distribution that has fat tails that occur unpredictably, but the result of a build-up of macroeconomic, financial and policy vulnerability, excessive risk-taking, debt, leverage, and therefore they are predictable. That's why there are white swans rather than black swans. And whether we've learned the lesson, I'm not sure, because many countries are talking about now reforming the system of supervision and regulation of financial institutions. Almost no one has done anything about it, and now we have near zero interest rates, and we're beginning of another asset bubble. And third of all, the crisis started from too much debt of the private sector, households, financial institutions. Now we've socialized these private losses. There is a massive build-up of debt and deficits on the public sector. That's the type of problem we're facing today in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, and eventually they're going to happen also in the United States. We cannot run a $1 trillion budget deficit forever.
The sovereign debt crisis, does that continue to be the outlier that concerns you most at this point? I mean, what, if anything, has been shown to us in the last few weeks is that this is truly an interconnected global economy, and whether you're just investing in the U.S. market, you have to care about what happens in Greece and Spain and Portugal, etc.
Absolutely. Even a small Greece can have contagious effects at the regional level and global level, and as I point out in the book, crises start from the private sector. Once they go on the balance sheet of the government with large budget deficits and public debt, eventually lead to sovereign risk rising and the risk of default and debt restructuring, or if you inflate it away by monetizing the deficit, eventually you're going to have inflation.
You've spoken a lot about that. You write about that in the book, monetizing the deficit, and governments not willing to make the hard choices being raise taxes and cut spending. Do you see any evidence that governments are doing that? Greece is getting hundreds of billions of dollars in aid, as you know, there's the support in terms of that for Spain and Portugal as well. So are governments making the hard choices, Nouriel, that they need to?
In part, the IMF and the European money to Greece, to Portugal, to Spain is going to be conditional on doing fiscal consolidation, so that's a positive. On the other side, the size of these deficits and debts is so large that, in my view, in a case like Greece, they eventually will have to restructure the debt. The kind of adjustment that is required of them is going to be social and politically impossible to achieve. And in many countries now, there is divided government. Like in the United States, there is a gridlock in Congress and in Washington. In the UK today, we have now a hung parliament. In Germany, just over the weekend, the majority of Merkel in the parliament was lost. So it's going to be more difficult for many more governments in the world that are weak governments or divided governments or countries where there is political gridlock to do the sacrifices, raising taxes, cutting spending, and that means that if those sacrifices are not made, eventually there is either a fiscal train wreck or if you print money to finance it, eventually have inflation.